Pour sand in their bulldozers, and you know, if you really want to stop them, then that seems legitimate. I mean,
right. Our group.
Is that nonviolent?
Yeah, our group does not, does not advocate that kind of action. In the end, we feel like the way that we conduct ourselves in trying to stop the harm is a very much a pathway to where we're going to end up. And so there's like a saying, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. We're really looking for a different way for folks to be in the world than this win-lose kind of, profit as the deciding factor in these important decisions. We want the people's welfare and safety and liberty, basically, to be the way those kind of decisions are made. I'm so admiring of the indigenous cultures, 7 generations forward kind of consideration in the way they make decisions.
All different forms of, all different diverse forms of what's considered nonviolence.
And another aspect, I'm glad you mentioned that. Part of the reason that we stayed and waited for law enforcement is that we knew that we were breaking the law. We knew we were trespassing on private property. We knew that we were doing some property destruction in cutting those chains. And so we took that action and broke those laws with full willingness to accept the consequences and be held accountable by courts for that action we took. And so that it very much was not a monkey wrenching kind of action. It was a put things on the table and be held accountable the way that we want the fossil fuel companies to be held accountable for the damage that they are doing.
Did you discuss what you could be prepared for, the sentencing aspect? I mean, you must have thought about that. I mean, you're putting out the extremes, but did you look at rationally what they might sentence you to or whatever? I mean, you must have talked about that, right?
We did. And that was really important for each member of the team to fully consider that risk to themselves and their families and really think about whether they were at a time in their lives and whether their other family and community obligations would allow them to spend some time in prison. And so we consulted with attorneys. We were told we might well be charged with felonies, that the fact that we did not have any other convictions under sentencing guidelines would probably mean that we wouldn't serve more than a year or 2. And so that's the basis I've been going forward on. Angela and I have been talking about what our lives will look like if I begin serving a year or 2 of time. What's the name of the city?
Deer Lodge.
Deer Lodge, the Montana. Yeah, the Montana State Prison near Deer Lodge. But, she's talked about whether she would come out once a month or, how we would stay connected during
to Missoula for 2 years.
Yeah, during the time when I might be in prison.
Leonard, I want to thank you for your commitment, for what you did, and all the other people that closed out those pipelines. It takes quite a bit of courage to do that commitment at so many levels. But I think many of us in this room also have commitments too. I don't want their oil. I don't want their gas. And I keep looking at what this community can do, what this community could look like if we didn't need their gas and their oil.
Yeah.
Now I've committed my whole life in this business to trying to focus on conservation because we all have choices too. We have choices in the way we live and how we drive. And if we didn't need those incredibly cheap resources, because that's the other thing, they're so cheap, why would we conserve them? $2.15 for
It's
Hazelwood,
ridiculous.
and that's with tax.
Yeah.
That's
Doesn't
just
represent the true cost.
No, it doesn't. So when we start putting the true cost on these resources, maybe we won't waste them as much. But I still think the behavior of all of us in each of our communities is so important to not need that stuff. Because all they are is they're the producers and the conveyors.
And so
the
this,
consumer side.
I don't know if everyone can hear, but the point he's making is that we as consumers have some ability to impact this problem, that if we stop creating the demand, that it would reduce the profit in supplying. He also pointed out, though, that the incentive to do other things is so difficult when gas is, like $2.50 a gallon or less. And it's the political and social pressure that we're trying to bring about in the action that we took is to try to remove the structure that the fossil fuel companies and in connection with government cooperation are holding over the populace. It's the continued emphasis on individual internal combustion, motor vehicles, the lack of effective intercity mass transit, the huge investment in the U.S. military. The U.S. military is the largest single user and carbon emission producer in the world. And that's not even part of what we talk about as a nation when we talk about reducing our carbon emissions. And so a lot of the impetus for that military is to protect our interests in fossil fuels, in fossil fuel infrastructure. There's so much the government does to subsidize that industry. And, you guys probably are aware of the comparisons between the strategy that the fossil fuel companies have been doing in the last couple of decades and the strategies that the tobacco companies did when it became a scientific fact that smoking cigarettes was causing lung and other types of cancer. It was a scientific fact, but it really helped to make it seem like it was still a debate, that it was not yet factual that tobacco smoking caused this harm. And that's the same thing that the fossil fuel industries have done. They've poured millions of, maybe billions of dollars between their lobbying of the Congress and the PR to keep the impression in the American public's perception that it's not settled, that maybe there's not a link between our carbon emissions and the change in climate, or maybe it's really not happening. And I think that if we could remove that obstacle that creates to the kind of change you're describing, there are so many people like yourself that are working on a different way of us living, that uses less energy, that creates energy from alternative sources, that if we remove that lock hold on our economy and our transportation and our infrastructure, I think that we've got a chance to change. The people are working on it.
You were mentioning the public relations part of it. Have you gotten any backlash? And to piggyback off of that, I know you were doing this in solidarity with Standing Rock. Has the fact that the few people that were involved with it, the fact that you guys were all white, and even more importantly, the fact that you guys were all older, has that affected anything with backlash or just with how it's being portrayed?
So two questions. The first question has to do with us hiring a PR company and doing our best to break into mainstream media with this message that we have about the threat of climate change. And the other question has to do with the fact that our whole team are white, mainly older people, and that we acted in solidarity and prayerful support of Standing Rock. He's asking whether there have been some points where maybe that wasn't as welcome a support as we hoped it might be. And so the answer to the first question, we definitely have things like the fossil fuel companies coming out and condemning what we did, saying that we created a risk of the kind of things that environmentalists don't want to happen, that what we did was not a acceptable way to express our First Amendment rights. We've had that kind of pushback. Is that the kind of thing you're looking for? And then, insofar as the other part, there were several of us that went to Standing Rock because we were concerned about how to support, how best to support and be a part of the work that the Standing Rock Sioux are doing in protecting the water and protecting life. We met with one of the elders and talked at some length, and we got her blessing for what we were doing. And we decided that the best way to do it was not on the same pipeline, and we really wanted to take it a step further rather than trying to stop a new infrastructure project or discovery of new fossil fuel resources. We wanted to demonstrate clearly that that's not enough, that we need to cut back on the current usage and the current flow of coal, oil, and gas to the market. And so we chose the tar sands oil, which along with the coal is the dirtiest source of emissions. And we did it in a way where we did our best not to create any repercussions, any more repercussions and consequences of standing the ground than the Standing Rock folks and their allies already were. We did it in support, but not in a way that would bring law enforcement to bear more strongly than they already were there at Standing Rock. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the care we took, and we received a lot of expressions of gratitude for doing the action in their support. So you haven't asked a question yet.
I was wondering if when you brought up the Defense Department or our military using so much fossil fuel, I'm wondering if, in your defense, if you could use some of their statements on how much climate change is affecting our national security. And there is officials, Pentagon. So I'm wondering if you looked into using that as part of your defense.
That's a very good point. He's pointing out that the Pentagon itself, the Department of Defense, has identified climate change as one of the largest threats to national security that are out there. And even that hasn't been enough to change U.S. policy as far as it needs to go. And that's a good idea. We are, especially as we bring our cases to court and are charged with proving to the court, to the jury, that there is imminent harm, that there is, that climate change is a true threat to human life, definitely we'll be calling on sources like that.
I believe they're even looking in greatly at like biofuels and alternative sources to fuel the war.
And there's a question, the gentleman back there in the green. I think you had your hand up, no? Oh, okay.
I did. I'm curious about some facts about, at some point when I was learning about Keystone XL, I locked it in my head that all the pipelines are headed to Texas and that the Koch brothers control the only refineries that can break down tar sands oil, really crude oil. Could you just take us through where each one of these pipelines were headed and how many companies controlled?
Gosh, some of our group, have that level of detail in their heads. I sure don't. We did identify the pipelines that we shut the emergency valves on as being the 5 pipelines at this point, that are bringing Canadian tar sands into the U.S. We didn't trace that down to the refineries where all of that oil was headed, and we didn't identify all of the ownership or control of those refineries. You're talking about following the money, which is always a good idea to really figure out where the power lies.
And were they all headed to Texas? Do you know if that's where the eventual?
I don't think all of the refineries are in Texas. We've got, several refineries in the Pacific Northwest, and there definitely is a concentration down there. There's a refinery in I think it's the Richland area in the Bay Area, Richmond, and so I don't think all of them are, but I agree there's a huge concentration of them in Texas. So all I can do is kind of respond in a conversational way. I don't have those facts.
It seems like this action was carried out by a pretty small group of people. Was there a larger group of people that were involved in it, kind of backing you up, or did you kind of keep the whole thing pretty close to the rest, as it were,
There was a very large number of people in a coalition that included folks from Idaho and Montana for the Break Free action in Anacortes.
Yeah.
And when we began conversation about it conceptually, there were, quite a few people that had been part of that planning and that strategy. But as soon as we started realizing where we were headed, we started having serious conversations about the level of risk, and that's when it came down to just a very few people. In fact, part of our uncertainty whether we were ready was if we had enough people to actually do the action the way we wanted to do it and document it. So it was quite small.
You noted that there were 2 people who weren't intending to risk arrest, were arrested. I guess there were 2 filmmakers, whomever. How did that happen? What situations? And what are they charged with? From what the rest of you are charged with?
And so you've got your hand up for the next time, or?
Oh,
okay.
Sure,
So okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was asking. There was 2 other people who were arrested who were not intending to risk arrest, and I was asking how that happened, what they were charged with, and so forth.
And so here in Montana, there was Reed that you saw in the video and who tried to talk with us. And his role was to live stream and, be supportive if I needed water or something like that. And so he did not trespass into the enclosure. He stayed out on the roadway. In fact, he had to because he couldn't get reception if he got close enough. I had to come out and get the water from him when I got thirsty onto public property. So he did not plan to be arrested. And then the videographer who we hired was more clear cut. At least in Montana here, the deputies questioned both of them, and they released the videographer and did not ever contact him again. Both Reed and the videographer, they brought in for questioning when they got back to Fort Benton. The block valve itself was about, depending on weather, a 30 to 45 minute drive from Fort Benton. And when they got back, they pulled them in for questioning at the sheriff's office and then released them. But in Reed's case, he was on his way to Bozeman, I don't even know how far, and they must have issued a warrant for his arrest because they actually pulled him over on the highway and brought him back to Fort Benton and put him in the same. I was very shocked. I looked out from the cell pod that I was in through a window and across the hall into another cell pod, and there was Reed standing there. I thought he was already well on the way headed
What
back
did
home.
he do wrong? He didn't trespass, he didn't do anything wrong. How could they arrest him?
What's he charged with?
And so he's charged with what in Oregon would be called an aiding and abetting. I forget the legal terminology.
Accessory?
It's like an accessory. It's an odd. I should have looked it up so I could answer that question. But it's a felony charge that carries the same penalties as I'm charged with, which are criminal trespass, a misdemeanor, and criminal mischief, which is a felony. In Montana, damage in excess of $1,500 that's fits the criteria for criminal mischief is judged to be a felony. And so quickly then, in the other states, almost without exception, like happened here, not only did they arrest the support people, but they also arrested the videographers. And as you saw in the film, most of those charges have been dropped. The videographer that did this film still has the Minnesota charges against him that we hope are dropped. I hope Reed's charges are dropped. And then the support person in North Dakota, Sam, is still facing as severe charges as Michael is that took the action.
Are you going to speak about the impacts of tar sands in a sense in your defense? Or did you purposely select those, or I'm trying to say in the context of the impact of that? Are you going to use that information in your defense? Why you chose that versus a regular oil pipeline maybe or something?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a balancing act in our necessity defense, particularly in the smaller courts. The attorneys that are really knowledgeable of these jurisdictions tell us if we come in any kind of big city kind of way and, call witness after witness and make the court feel like we're wasting their time, that will go very strongly against us. And so the challenge is to present a strong case in as short and concise and strong a way as we can. And I definitely think that showing some pictures of what the extraction process looks like in Alberta, showing some of the oil spills and the damage done by that, and then talking about it as a source of carbon emissions is important. But I don't, better minds than mine are going to be figuring out how to put that together. And so there's another one. I don't think you've asked a question yet.
Not yet. I'm curious if you have any sense yet from the judge or the prosecutor how much resistance there will be to you actually presenting the necessity defense.
So Steve Gannon, the county prosecutor in Chouteau County, told us yesterday that he thinks it's really unlikely that Judge Bouchard, help me if someone knows if that's the right pronunciation for his name, it's Bouchard, thinks it's very unlikely that judge will allow us to present the necessity defense. He thinks, though, he's supportive, and he thinks the judge is supportive of doing it in a way technically that allows us very quickly to appeal it to the Montana State Supreme Court. He was not at all optimistic that we would do well in Montana Supreme Court, but that I thought that given the circumstances and the job he has, that's I really appreciated him putting cards on the table, so to speak.